What if I told you that stupidity isn't merely a lack of intelligence, but a far more dangerous force? A force capable of turning brilliant minds into tools of destruction. What if the real threat to civilization isn't evil, acts by evil people, but ordinary folks who've stopped thinking? Imagine this: a renowned scientist with multiple degrees begins spreading dangerous misinformation. A compassionate teacher starts promoting harmful ideologies. A loving parent begins making choices that put their children at risk. These aren't evil individuals. They're smart, well-intentioned people who've succumbed to what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called the power of stupidity. And here's what makes this truly alarming. It's not just happening to others. It's happening to people like you and me. This isn't mere philosophical musing. In 1961, Stanley Milgram ran his notorious obedience experiments at Yale University. Ordinary volunteers were told by an authority figure to deliver what they thought were increasingly painful electric shocks to someone else. Despite hearing cries of pain, 65% of participants administered shocks they believed could be deadly. These weren't sadists or mentally unstable. They were ordinary people who had momentarily given up their ability to make independent moral judgments. This is precisely what Bonhoeffer saw in Nazi Germany, leading him to formulate one of the most disturbing theories about human nature. Before we go further, ask yourself, have you ever believed something just because everyone else did? Hold that question as we delve into one of the most critical psychological insights of our time. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't a typical philosopher musing in an ivory tower. He was a German Lutheran pastor who saw his society transform before his eyes. Born in 1906 to an intellectual family with a prominent psychiatrist father, Bonhoeffer had every reason to trust in education and rational discourse. But as the Nazi Party gained power, Bonhoeffer saw something that destroyed his faith in human rationality. He saw educated, cultured, religious Germans support policies and leaders that contradicted their stated beliefs. These weren't ignorant masses swayed by clever propaganda. These were professors, doctors, clergy, and intellectuals actively engaging in their own intellectual surrender. From his prison cell in 1943, awaiting execution for his part in a plot to kill Hitler, Bonhoeffer wrote his most chilling observation: "Against stupidity we are powerless. Neither protests nor force achieve anything. Here, reason falls on deaf ears." What made this observation so chilling was not just its context, but its accuracy. Evil, he observed, carries the seeds of its own downfall. It sparks only resistance and eventual collapse. But stupidity believes it's doing good, making it completely resistant to correction. Perhaps Bonhoeffer's most insightful observation was how stupidity serves existing power structures. Malicious people know they're wrong, creating internal conflict and eventual collapse. But those trapped in functional stupidity believe they're doing good, making them entirely resistant to correction. This isn't by chance. Those in power no longer need to actively suppress information. They only need to create conditions where honest information processing becomes extremely difficult. When Bono first spoke of stupidity, he wasn't referring to low IQ or lack of education. He was describing something more complex, what we might call functional stupidity or willful ignorance. In his prison letters he wrote, "The stubbornness of the stupid person shouldn't hide the fact that he's not independent. In talking to him, You feel you're not dealing with a person, but with slogans and catchphrases that have taken over. Here's what made Bonhoeffer's theory so groundbreaking. He argued that stupidity often stems from individual flaws, but from systemic pressures that make independent thinking difficult and costly. The reality is our economic systems actively encourage intellectual shortcuts. Social media platforms profit billions when users react emotionally instead of thinking critically. News outlets gain more clicks with outrage than with nuance. Politicians win elections with simple slogans rather than detailed policy proposals. When people juggle multiple jobs, drown in debt, and face constant information overload, intellectual surrender becomes a survival tactic. What economists term rational ignorance arises. It's more efficient for individuals to stay uninformed about complex issues than to invest the time and energy needed for true understanding. But this individual rationality leads to collective irrationality, the exact dynamic Bonhoeffer saw in Nazi Germany. The result isn't merely individual choice. It's structural pressure toward intellectual surrender, and our brains stressed and overwhelmed are perfectly wired to comply. While economic systems drive us toward intellectual shortcuts, our brains are wired to comply. Leon Festinger's pioneering 1950s research on cognitive dissonance explained how this works psychologically. When people face information that contradicts their beliefs, their brains resist it. But here's what Bonhoeffer grasped, which modern psychology has confirmed. This process intensifies when people are stressed, overwhelmed, or economically insecure. Precisely the conditions our current systems foster. Bonhoeffer noted that stupidity often arises in group settings. He wrote that stupidity is not a psychological issue, but a sociological one. He observed that rational individuals abandon critical thinking when they join a larger group or movement. This insight was far ahead of its time. Solomon Asch's 1950s conformity experiments confirmed what Bonhoeffer had seen. When surrounded by a group giving clearly wrong answers, 75% of people conform at least once, even knowing the group is wrong. Now consider how this unfolds in our digital era. Social media algorithms create echo chambers that make this transformation easier than ever. A 2018 MIT study found that false information spreads 6 times faster than true information on social platforms. But here's the key insight. It's because false information often feels more emotionally satisfying than complex truths. When someone shares misinformation that aligns with their worldview, they're engaging in a system that rewards intellectual shortcuts over careful analysis. The algorithm feeds them more of the same, creating echo chambers that act like intellectual quicksand. Have you noticed how your social media feed seems to show exactly what you want to see? That's not by chance. It's the architecture of chosen ignorance at work. We see this pattern repeat throughout history. The Salem witch trials weren't led by evil people, but by God-fearing community members who truly believed they were protecting their neighbors. The 1950s Red Scare wasn't driven by malicious actors, but by patriotic Americans who genuinely thought they were defending democracy. In each case, intelligent, educated people abandoned critical thinking for group consensus and emotional certainty. If our brains and systems are stacked against us, how do we resist? Bonhoeffer believed that escaping stupidity demands what he called costly grace. The willingness to think independently, even when it's painful, unpopular, or dangerous. But now we know we're not just battling social pressure. We're fighting millions of years of evolution and billion-dollar algorithms designed to exploit our mental shortcuts. On an individual level, we can foster what psychologists call intellectual humility, the acknowledgement that our knowledge is always incomplete and possibly wrong. This means actively seeking information that challenges our beliefs, not to torment ourselves, but to test if our beliefs hold up. Here are practical steps to serve as your daily defense against intellectual surrender. First, practice intellectual friction. Dedicate time weekly to read thoughtful arguments from those who disagree with you, not to change your mind, but to test if your convictions can withstand scrutiny. Second, embrace productive ignorance. When you're absolutely certain about something, ask what evidence would change your mind. If you can't think of any, that's a warning sign. Third, slow down your sharing before posting online. Take 60 seconds to verify it with an independent source. That brief pause can disrupt the algorithmic cycle that thrives on our emotional reactions. Finally, practice saying "I don't know" when you truly don't know something. In a world that rewards confident ignorance over humble uncertainty, admitting knowledge gaps is a radical act. But individual efforts aren't enough. We also need structural changes to make intellectual honesty easier and more rewarding. This means requiring social media platforms to disclose their algorithmic biases and content curation methods. It means funding robust public media literacy campaigns to teach people how to evaluate sources and evidence. It means designing online platforms that reward intellectual humility over tribal certainty. Most crucially, we need economic policies that reduce the stress and uncertainty that make people susceptible to intellectual shortcuts. When people aren't constantly stressed about healthcare, housing and jobs, they have more mental space for careful thinking about complex issues. Bonhoeffer's theory was brilliant for its era, but here's what he couldn't have foreseen. This isn't just about moral surrender or social pressure. Modern neuroscience reveals something far more disturbing. Our brains are wired to slip into functional stupidity. Consider this. Bonhoeffer saw Nazi propaganda spread through newspapers and radio. But we're facing something exponentially more dangerous. We've moved from Nazi propaganda to social media algorithms that know exactly which psychological buttons to push. And now we're entering an era of AI, deepfakes that can fabricate reality itself. The threat isn't just growing. It's targeting the very structure of human cognition. This isn't just about Nazis or propaganda. It's about how your brain is wired. Our minds evolved to prioritize speed over accuracy, to trust familiar sources over unfamiliar ones, and seek information that confirms our existing beliefs. These were survival traits that helped our ancestors make quick decisions when hesitation could mean death. The scariest part, we're all vulnerable, no matter how smart we think we are. The mechanism is exactly what Bonhoeffer described. When people feel threatened and uncertain, they're more open to authoritative explanations that simplify complex issues. But here's the critical insight that makes Bonhoeffer's warning more urgent than ever. We're no longer just dealing with human manipulation. We're facing AI-designed systems that exploit our cognitive weaknesses with surgical precision. Every click, pause, and emotional reaction is analyzed, and used against our ability to think independently. We saw this unfold in real time during COVID-19. Doctors, engineers, and lawyers, people with proven analytical skills, began sharing debunked theories about vaccines and treatments. These weren't failures of intelligence. They were failures of intellectual independence under unprecedented pressure. Bonhoeffer paid the ultimate price for refusing to surrender his intellectual independence. He was executed by hanging on April 9, 1945. Just weeks before Germany's surrender, his last words for a fellow prisoner were, "This is the end for me, the beginning of life." His sacrifice wasn't just about political resistance. It was about defending the very possibility of human thought. He understood that when people stop thinking independently, they cease to be fully human. They become, in his words, puppets controlled by the strongest force of the moment. But here's what makes Bonhoeffer's final challenge so relevant today. Who stands firm when the pressure to conform is immense? When independent thinking demands courage, when truth costs more than comfortable lies, who stands firm? The answer lies not in superior intelligence or education. It's found in the daily choice to stay curious over certain, to seek truth over comfort, to think carefully rather than react quickly. These aren't heroic deeds. They are ordinary practices that become extraordinary when others stop doing them. The tragedy is that intellectual surrender often feels like freedom. Thinking is hard work. It's uncomfortable to hold complex, contradictory ideas in your mind at once. It's painful to admit you might be wrong about something important. But Bonhoeffer argued that this discomfort is the price of staying human. In a world that profits from our intellectual surrender, choosing to think for ourselves is a radical act. This brings us to perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. We're all vulnerable to functional stupidity. The moment we think we're immune, we've already started to fall. The price of intellectual freedom is constant vigilance, not against external enemies, but against our own tendency to stop thinking when it gets hard. Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity is unsettling because it's so accurate. We see it everywhere. Smart people believing obviously false things. Educated individuals making disastrous decisions. Well-meaning citizens backing policies that contradict their values. The issue isn't that people are becoming less intelligent. It's that our systems increasingly reward intellectual shortcuts over careful thinking. But within this grim diagnosis lies real hope. If stupidity is partly chosen, it can also be rejected. If it's partly structural, structures can be changed. If it's due to cognitive overload, we can create conditions that make thinking easier, not harder. Think of critical thinking like physical exercise. It's uncomfortable at first, but vital for strength. Just as we wouldn't expect to run a marathon, without training we can't navigate complex information. Without practicing intellectual discipline, the mental muscles needed for independent thought require regular use or they weaken. The next time you're certain about something, dismissing contradictory evidence, or feeling the comfort of having all the answers, recall Bonhoeffer's warning. Functional stupidity doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers that you already know all you need to know. And in that moment of realization, you have a choice. Will you surrender your mind to the comfort of certainty, or choose the harder path of intellectual independence? The question von Neumann leaves us isn't whether we're smart enough to avoid stupidity. It's whether we're committed enough to keep thinking when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, or costly. In a world that profits from our intellectual surrender, choosing to think carefully and independently is one of the most important things we can do. Here's my challenge to you this week. Find one belief you hold strongly and spend 30 minutes researching the best arguments against it, not to torment yourself or be paralyzed by doubt, but to practice the intellectual courage Bonhoeffer died defending. If your belief withstands honest scrutiny, you'll hold it with greater confidence. If it doesn't, you'll learn something valuable about the difference between conviction and truth. The future of human dignity may depend on how we collectively respond to Bonhoeffer's challenge. If this has made you question something you were certain of, that's not a weakness. It's the start of intellectual courage. Share this with someone unafraid to think deeply, even when it's uncomfortable. Because in a world that profits from our intellectual surrender, thinking carefully becomes our most vital form of resistance. And here's what I want you to remember. Every time you choose curiosity over certainty, evidence over emotion, careful thinking over quick reactions, you're not just protecting your mind. You're defending the possibility of human wisdom in an age of artificial stupidity. What's one belief you're willing to question this week? Let me know in the comments. And let's commit to being people who stand firm when others stop thinking.